Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first installment of Gender Talk for this semester. My name is Meredith Lee, and I'm an assistant professor in Women's and Gender Studies here at Berea College. I'd like to start by thanking our co-sponsor, the Political Science Department, for their generous contribution to today's event and for their support of Women and Gender Studies programming more generally. And thank you to Dr. Shadi Malaklu, Chair of Women and Gender Studies and the organizer of this event today. I'd also like to thank the hard work of the WGS staff, my administrative colleague, Kimberly Staderholm, and student colleague, Mandy Snowden. Without their tireless efforts, the Gender Talk series would not be possible. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Judy Wu, who was in fact my dissertation co-advisor and mentor throughout graduate school, so thank you for that. Dr. Wu is a professor of Asian American Studies, as well as the director of the Humanities Center at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Wu's research primarily focuses on analyzing intersecting social hierarchies, such as those based on race, gender, sexuality, and citizenship. She is particularly interested in understanding how individuals form identities and navigate protest social inequalities. Dr. Wu has written 2 books and is working on her 3rd. Her first book was a biography of Margaret Jessie Chung, the first American-born Chinese woman doctor. Her second book examined the international travels of American anti-war activists and how these journeys shaped their political identities and goals. Her 3rd book is a political biography of Patsy Takemoto Mink, the first woman of color U.S. congressional representative and the co-sponsor of Title IX. She is working in collaboration with Mink's daughter, political scientist Gwendolyn Mink. In today's presentation, Asian American Women and Social Justice, Where Do We Stand? Dr. Wu explores the Asian American feminism's stage critiques of racialized and gendered structures of US militarized empire by choosing alliances with women of color feminisms. And today's respondent is Berea College's own assistant professor of political science and Asian studies, Dr. Lauren McKee. Dr. McKee has published research on women's labor and the oil and gas industries in the Journal of International Women's Studies and is now working on a book about Japanese politics and government. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker and respondent.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's so wonderful to be welcomed by students I've worked with previously, Meredith and Shadi, and I'm so thrilled that you're doing such fantastic work in Berea. And I also am excited to speak to you because I used to teach at Ohio State University, so just up north from Kentucky. And it's nice to be able to reconnect with people who are in the Midwest. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I want to talk to you about these ideas, but I'm also open to pausing if you have comments, questions, reactions. I believe we're going to use the Q&A function. I'll try to keep my eye on that. But if you want to wait until the end to talk to me, I'm happy to do that as well. And I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about my Zoom background a little bit later. So I want to begin with this quote, and it's a more extended version of what I shared with you for the description of the talk. I recently read Cathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, and if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to do so. If you notice the subtitle, An Asian American Reckoning, it's a chance for her to really think through very deeply about what it means to exist in our current society, and the ways in which she, as an Asian American woman, has been racialized and gendered. I won't read this entire quote. I hope you're reading it on your own, but some things that really stuck out to me, right? I replaced the word white with disappear when she thinks about Asians being next in line to being white. She talks about this insistence that race doesn't matter for Asian Americans, right? Our race has nothing to do with this country, even, which is why we're often listed as other in polls and why we're hard to find in racial breakdowns on reported rape or workplace discrimination or domestic abuse. It's like being ghosted. And I want to respond to this feeling of invisibility by thinking about how historically Asian American women have stood up, have protested the existing power structure, have identified and allied with other women of color. So I want to contrast that particular passage with a poem written by Jenny Lim. She's a poet as well as playwright based in San Francisco. She was one of the authors that was featured in This Bridge Called My Back, which is one of the most important foundational texts for women of color feminism. So if you look at the poem, again, I won't read it. I hope you'll do so on your own, but she's gesturing towards, right, women of different body types, women of different racial backgrounds, different status, in terms of relationship to marriage and their relationship with their own bodies. She's talking about women connecting around the world. So Samarkand is one of the oldest cities, sites on the Silk Road, San Francisco, where she herself is based, and the Mekong River Delta that winds through Southeast Asia. And the conflicts in Southeast Asia was so central in the late 60s and 70s in creating a sense of third world identity and helping to define third world feminism. So I want to come to my topic today, thinking about Asian American feminism. Where do we stand? The ways in which feminism often is taught is very much centered on white middle-class women's movements. And I'm sure your professors and your student colleagues have talked about this. Even the ways in which we characterize the history of feminism, which often is told in terms of the wave analogy, the first wave culminating with the passage of the 19th Amendment, which we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of this year. The second wave, referring to the 60s and 70s, the impact of the civil rights movement, anti-war movement on creating a women's movement. And then oftentimes a third wave associated with the 1990s, in which intersectionality is much more explicitly part of the way we think about feminism. But in each of these discussions, oftentimes the main historical actors are centered on white middle-class women. And it's their activities, their worldviews that tend to be privileged in this telling of feminism. And so I want another way in which Asian Americans are excluded from the history of feminism is to think about women of color without Asian Americans. And I think that's very much the common usage today. So that has to do with the ways in which Asian Americans are constructed as model minorities, right? Even that phrase suggests that they are somehow exceptional compared to other racialized groups, that they don't suffer, or at least they don't have the same reaction outcome in relation to other groups. And this very much was a conscious political project. If you look at some of the early writings that depict Asian Americans as model minorities, they often will say, in contrast to African Americans, in contrast to other groups. So to try to pit these various groups against each other and suggesting that one can demonstrate the existence of meritocracy, can affirm that there may be obstacles, but they're overcomable, right? And I think another way in which Asian Americans are often left out of a sense of political alliance with other groups is that they're orientalized, and for Asian American women, they're hypersexualized. And so the sense that they are not political beings, they might be economic beings, they might be good students, and they might be objects of desire for Orientist fetishization, but they themselves do not have a sense of political subjectivity. This is something that Mitsuyo Yamada, who's a groundbreaking author, human rights activist, has talked about. She actually lives very close to UC Irvine. She's in her mid-90s and she's still writing. But she has this very important essay that appeared in This Bridge Called My Back and has been reproduced in other anthologies about feminism as well. To finally recognize our own invisibility is to finally be on the path toward visibility. Invisibility is not a natural state for anyone. And so in some ways she is speaking to, or Cathy Park Hong is speaking to Mitsuyo Yamada to try to unpack why this invisibility exists. And so today I want to emphasize two main points to you. One is the role in which Asian American women have helped to co-create, co-produce radical women of color feminisms. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that evolved. And I also want to talk about how Asian American women have contributed to what we might call liberal feminism, Although I want to also question some of these boundaries between the liberal and the radical. And I'd like to evoke Shayla Sandoval's quote about women of color feminism, that it operates through a differential consciousness that refuses any singular approach to resisting multiple intersecting oppressions. So rather than think about either these discrete ways or to think about different political orientations, I think it's also important to think about how women blur those boundaries, try to come up with creative political strategies, develop political theories to help make sense of what their existence and their experiences are. And perhaps not be so fixated on radical, liberal, although I think it's important to make political distinctions as well. So I'd like to go back to the period of the 60s and 70s, right, consider the second wave movement. And even then, right, there's sort of a mini chronology that emerges that focuses first on white women's experiences, then on women of color, then on lesbian radical feminism, then on socialist feminism, right? There's sort of an inherent chronology in the way we tend to narrate that period rather than thinking about it in a much more complex way. So first I want to foreground how the concept of the third world, the sense of internationalism, the sense of connections across nations was foundational in even creating the identity of Asian American. And here I'd like to share an oral history that I conducted with an activist from that time period. Donna Kataka is a sansei, which means that she's a third generation Japanese American. And there were a number of third generation Japanese Americans who were active during the 60s and 70s. So she says about her own identity growing up and coming of age politically, your whole identity is not Asian, right? Your identity, it was just like you wanted to be a white person. So again, evoking the sense that Cathy Park Hong is talking about. So to us at that point, identifying ourselves as Asian American, right, to kind of claim a racial identity that is based in the United States, wanting to learn more about our own histories, you know, being proud of the histories. And I think really hooking up with other non-whites was a really big deal. So, you know, there's the identity going on of being Asian, there's a third world coming, coalitions coming together, there's this international thing with Vietnam, and at some point, at the same time, people talking about China and seeing what a shining example of, you know, what it would be like to be free, people who care about people and a country that provides for everyone. Now, given the intense rhetoric between the United States and China now, and given the existing society that exists in China now, this sounds hyperbolic, this sounds very idealized, but going back to that time period, there was a tremendous critique of the United States empire that was expressed through the war in Southeast Asia, and I can talk more about that. But there was also the sense that people were looking for alternative role models. What are there alternative pathways into creating a society that do not rely on the same foundation economically, racially, in terms of gender roles, right? Are there alternative models out there? And for many people during the 60s and 70s, they were turning to third world countries, especially third world socialist countries. But I would just want to emphasize that for this particular person, her turning away from whiteness, her embrace of her own identity was both a domestic racial understanding, thinking about how different ethnic groups come together to form Asian identity, Asian American identity, a domestic alliance with other people of color at that time, but it was also a global alliance, thinking that she had a connection with women in Southeast Asia who were fighting the war against the United States. So some of these images that you see here are from movement publications at that time period. There's a foundational text called Asian Women that was published from UC Berkeley. They featured both domestic issues, but also global issues, including a conference that was held in 1971 in Vancouver and also in Toronto. Oh, I'm blanking. I think it is Toronto. These were called the Indo-Chinese Women's Conferences that allowed women from Southeast Asia who were engaged in the war there to come meet with their North American feminist sisters. Ghidro was a publication that was based in Los Angeles at that time. And this is an image that was widely circulated at that time, or a version of this image. And it wasn't just sort of an Asian peasant woman, but it was sort of a third world peasant woman. You have her with an AK-47 in one hand and a baby in the other, suggesting that there was a way in which she can model revolutionary motherhood, that she could both engage in militarism, fighting for her country, fighting for independence, and at the same time fulfill her role as being a mother. This is a theme that was very important for the Asian American community, but it was also true for other radical movements at that time. And one of the main contributions that Asian and Asian American women made to the formulation of radical feminism is to really think about the relationship between gender and militarism. This is Donna Kataka talking about going to the Indo-Chinese Women's Conference and encountering women who are creating revolutions, who are leading revolutions, and what it felt like to actually see somebody who looked like her in that type of political role. Kiku Uno was one of the few Niseis, which is second generation Japanese American, and so she was older than a lot of the people who went. I don't know her exact age, but it's likely that she was more like 40s or 50s or something like that compared to the women who were coming in as third generation who were in their 20s or so. I don't know if people have heard about Yuri Kochiyama. She's becoming more well-known. She was a Black liberation movement activist who was based in the East Coast, has very close ties with Malcolm X. And in fact, the day that he was assassinated, she was there and held him as he passed away. And even though she didn't attend the Indo-Chinese Women's Conference herself, she heard stories about that gathering that brought women from mostly the United States, some women from Canada, and women together from Southeast Asia, and how transformative it was to think about those global connections. I won't go into intersectionality because I think you will have had a chance to talk about this in your class, but I do want to highlight the idea of triple oppression, which is a term or a phrase or a concept that emerges from this time period, the 60s and 70s, in thinking about the intersecting impact of capitalism, of imperialism, and patriarchy. Pat Sumi is an anti-militarism activist who is based in Southern California, predominantly near San Diego, but also eventually Los Angeles and San Francisco. She had a chance to travel to Socialist Asia with Eldridge Cleaver and Elaine Brown, the Black Panther Party. And she reported back what she was experiencing and learning. I won't read this quote, and hopefully you will, but I just want to give you a sense of what it was like to actually see women of color, in this case particularly Asian women, trying to figure out how to decolonize their countries, trying to figure out how to end war. And that there was a deep connection in thinking about national independence, overthrowing the United States, involvement in these countries, and defining a new role for women, and particularly for poor people, for laboring people. This is the politics that was happening globally, but also locally. So for example, in places like San Francisco, there were people investigating the conditions of garment workers, of restaurant workers, the living conditions of people in highly dense neighborhoods, the lack of urban spaces. So really trying to think about how capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy function not just abroad, but also within the United States. So I mentioned before, one of the main contributions of Asian American women to the formulation of third world feminism, women of color feminism, is to really think about the connections between militarism and race and gender. I find Joanne Nagel, who's a sociologist, her concept of the military sexual complex very compelling in trying to think through these ideas. So she's doing a play on President Eisenhower's military industrial complex. As he was leaving the political office of the presidency, he warned about the ways in which the US military state was deeply intertwined with the industrial capacity of the United States. And that alliance was something that deeply worried him, even though he had been a general and even though he had been the president. And what Joanne Nagel was pointing out is that there's a similar penetration between the US military and practices, ideas about sexuality. And here's just one example of how women of color during the 60s and 70s are identifying that interconnection between the military and the sexual. This is This is from a publication by Evelyn Yoshimura. She's still an activist that's based in Southern California. But she's recounting here a story that's being told by an Asian American soldier in the US military. We had these classes we had to go to taught by drill instructors, and every instructor would tell a joke before he began class. It would always be a dirty joke, usually having to do with prostitutes they had seen in Japan or in other parts of Asia while they were stationed overseas. The attitude of the Asian women being a doll, a useful toy, or something to play with usually came out in these jokes, and how they were not quite as human as white women, how Asian women's vaginas weren't like a white woman's, but rather they were slanted like their eyes. There are other stories of Asian American soldiers being brought up to the front of their troops and pointed out as this is what the enemy looks like. The ways in which warfare, especially US warfare in Asia, racializes very deeply Asian American experiences, such that even someone in their own troop can be viewed fundamentally as an enemy because of their race. Now, in this story, which I find fascinating, really disturbing, but fascinating, you see how the socialization process of becoming a fighting force is based on this informal culture of denigrating, dehumanizing Asian women. That there's both the actual practice of fostering the sex trade in places where Asian military troops are based, and they are increasingly being expanded during the Cold War. So you have troops in Japan, in Okinawa, in Taiwan, in South Korea, in the Philippines, all these different locations in which they're based. There are consciously created R&R zones in which US military men can go out and blow off steam, interact with the locals. And oftentimes those relationships are around commercialized sex, right? And so you see the violence of this. There might actually be physical violence in terms of rape, coercion, but there's also this epistemological violence, the sense that these women are just here to satisfy white male military desires, and that they become subjects of jokes that then become the basis for forming an insider group among the US military. And that sense of dehumanization contributes to the ways in which the war was conducted and wars are conducted. This is a quote from Ellen Yoshimura, in which she talks about how these racialized, sexualized representations don't just stay over there. They originate from the United States. It's the fantasies that American military personnel bring with them. They get reinforced in terms of the interactions they have in Asia, and they get brought back and have an impact in the ways in which Asian women are treated and regarded in the United States as well. I just wanted to point out this depiction of Vietnamese women involved in fighting the war in Vietnam. Oftentimes, the United States, they're viewed as prostitutes, but they were an integral component of the war against US occupation in Vietnam. I'm going to go over some of this a little bit more quickly, just thinking about the time involved. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to post. But this is just one element in the ways in which Asian American women are co-producing, defining, expanding the understandings of women of color feminism. Another way you might think about this is the critiques about reproduction and about genocide. This is a publication, or this particular essay, right, thinks about the ways in which the politics of reproduction, the idea that there's too many people on this earth and need to control the reproduction of women of color globally, is part of a broader racial agenda that's both domestic and international. So I mentioned before the ways in which the war in Vietnam was conducted. It was the second longest war until now with Afghanistan. What's really striking to me is that if you take all the bombs that were dropped during World War II, right, it's a global war, World War II, and you triple that, was how much was dropped on Vietnam, right? Triple the amount of bombs that were dropped during World War II are dropped on Vietnam, and Vietnam's a relatively small country. Twice as many bombs were dropped on the South which is the US ally. There's a famous quote by US military personnel who said, you know, we had to destroy it in order to save it. We had to destroy this village in order to save it from communism. And so I think that quote really helps encapsulate the ways in which the war was conducted in Vietnam. And it was not, the conventional weapons were horrific. There were uses of cluster bombs, the bombing of civilian targets. And the distinction between civilian and military is very difficult, given that it was a guerrilla warfare. But also the use of chemical weapons. And the impact of chemical weapons goes long beyond the duration of the war. Even the conventional weapons go long beyond the conventional war. There are bombs still being discovered in Vietnam today that have been left over. But the chemical impact is on the land, on the bodies of the people who are there. You can think about this, arguably, this policy of genocide and the impact and how it draws on other reproductive technologies and reproductive testing technologies. Like the fact that the pill was developed in Puerto Rico using test subjects there. The practice of forced sterilization of women in the United States, oftentimes poor women, women of color, people with disabilities. And there's also a connection, not just in terms of biological control of reproduction and warfare, but also the ways in which the nation seeks to control the social composition of the nation by closing off borders. I won't go into this in great detail. I'll just raise this here, and I'm happy to talk more about this later. So I want to shift in thinking about not just Asian American contributions in thinking about radical critiques of the US state, the US economy, but also trying to think about how Asian American women have tried to work within the system to push the system. So here I'd like to turn more to Patsy Takemoto Mink. For those who don't know, she was the first Japanese American woman to become a lawyer in Hawaii, although I think that's probably true for the entire continent as well. She was the first woman of color to go into Congress, and I think that's something that, again, most people don't recognize. Oftentimes I think people think of Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African-American woman, but she was elected after Mink. She is the co-author of Title IX, and when Patsy Mink passed away in 2002, Title IX has been renamed after Patsy Mink. Again, something that I think most people don't know. I'm trying to publish my book in 2022, which is the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And I'm hoping that that will encourage people to think about this history and her contributions and to recognize it more widely. So here I'm going to focus on legislative feminism. Right, the discussions I had previously were women who are on the grassroots, and they might be doing grassroots organizing globally, right? They're going into Canada, they're traveling internationally, but it's very much grassroots activism. But here's somebody who is in a formal position, an elected official, who's at the table, who is designing legislation, and the ways in which she's trying to push the envelope as well from that standpoint. And here I want to use some concepts that I think are very useful. Anastasia Kerwood, who's based in Kentucky, is writing a biography of Shirley Chisholm, and she talks about Shirley Chisholm being a bridge feminist. So someone who's not sort of an exceptional figure, although she was, just like Mink, but someone who's trying to connect what they're doing legislatively with grassroots politics. So in the case of Shirley Chisholm, she's thinking about the connection between the civil rights movement and the women's movement. She's thinking about the grassroots and electoral politics. And I also want to use a concept that Rachel Pierce, who got her PhD from the University of Virginia, talks about. She describes as Capitol Hill feminism, the ways in which the goals and the vision of the grassroots feminist movement shaped what feminist legislators were doing on Capitol Hill. Let me just check. I think I'm going to go over this very quickly and then just focus a little bit more on a particular case study with childcare, and then think about some of the tensions between radical and liberal feminism. Mink is from the islands of Hawaii, and I wanted to show this map to you because what happens on Hawaii the occupation of indigenous lands, of Pacific Islander lands, was really part of a broader naval and imperial strategy of the United States. If you look at all these different islands and the dates in which they become incorporated into the United States, it's the mid to late 19th century. And this is the era in which the United States is thinking about how to expand beyond the continent, how to assert its power globally, and naval power was essential to that. So all these different islands, they're way stations. They're places in which ships can stop. They're places in which the United States might build naval outposts so that they can secure, the United States can secure its presence throughout the Pacific in order to access the markets, the countries, the goods of Asia. And a similar process is happening in the Caribbean during this time period as well. In transforming Hawaii from a native Hawaiian kingdom, it involved an economic process as well as a political process, and the establishment of plantation systems. So the growing of pineapple, of sugar, and that required labor. Given that Native Hawaiians are being displaced from their own lands, the United States turned to importing laborers from abroad, such that by the early 20th century, and this is very unusual for any territory or any land that's part of the United States, Asian Americans and immigrants constitute almost 2/3 of the population. And you will know how Native Hawaiians have drastically decreased in terms of population in relation to the broader whole as a result of basically settler colonialism. What's also interesting in Hawaii is that by the mid-20th century, the people who had been the have-nots, the people who had been the plantation laborers, the people who are on the bottom of the social hierarchy are now asserting its power politically. And so Hawaii experiences what's described as the democratic revolution. So workers, racialized groups, they're coming together to form and to strengthen the Democratic Party and take over the political apparatus from the plantation owners and people who are considered haoles, whites. And they're advocating for full partnership into the United States. Hawaii is the last state, and it's no accident that it's the last state. If you think about some of the politics around statehood in terms of Puerto Rico, there's a lot of concerns throughout this time period about too many non-white people in Hawaii, and also because of the labor and labor activism, concerns about communism. I can go more in details about this, but I just want to point out for purposes of today's talk that this process of the democratic revolution is not something that was completely supported. For example, obtaining statehood, which for some people were seen as a major achievement, for Native Hawaiians who were seeking sovereignty, statehood is not about equality, it's about taking away their independence. And I'll come back to this theme at the end. But I also want to point out the gendered process of this settler colonial experience and also the democratic political experience. So Patsy Mink was someone who was politically mobilized during this time period. She advocated for the Democratic Party, but they really regard her and accepted her as a behind-the-scenes organizer. When she wanted to run, there was much less interest in having her do so by the party. And when she challenged the party hierarchy, they basically withdrew support from her. And so she had a very interesting relationship with this party that she believed in terms of political ideals, but in terms of on the grounds sort of operations, there were a lot of battles that really tried to marginalize her. So I pointed out that even for someone who's trying to work within the system, Patsy Mink was someone who's trying to change the system as well. And one example of that is that she was trying to advocate for federally funded childcare. As we're all experiencing the lockdown now, a lot of people are, the sort of tensions between paid work and unpaid work, work outside the home, work within the home, care work, it's becoming much more visible, right? The type of labor that oftentimes is taken for granted. And Mink really tried to point out there was a need for a federal system that provided adequate childcare for women increasingly working outside the home, working for pay, and that it should not just be custodial, that it should be meaningful childhood education. This comes out of coming from Hawaii. You'll see at the top, the women who are part of the plantation system are not immune to the labor system there. They were expected to work as well for less pay. They were doing backbreaking work in the fields. There was no childcare. You worked until you gave birth and you came back as soon as you can. And people worked out informal arrangements. Maybe older members of the community might look after some young kids. Maybe older children would look after young kids. Right? There is no systemic way to support women in the workforce, although their labor was expected and demanded both by the plantations and by their families. But you see early on in the labor movement in Hawaii, the efforts to incorporate reproductive labor and the needs for reproductive labor, the needs for addressing reproductive labor as part of the labor movement. And this is true more broadly for women of color who have historically had much higher participation rates in paid work, and ways in which they have to compromise their own reproductive care for their own families in providing reproductive care oftentimes for white families. This is very much something that comes out of her own experience, Patsy Mink's own experience of being a working mother. She went to law school. She wanted to go to medical school, but nobody would accept her in the aftermath of World War II when the GIs coming back. She went to law school instead. And when she graduated from law school, nobody would hire her. She was Asian American. She was a woman. She had just given birth to her daughter, Wendy Mink, and was a mother of a young child. So she ended up working at the University of Chicago Library or working at a department store. When she moved back to Hawaii, because she was hoping for more opportunities there, there was a very clear hierarchy there as well. If you're a haole, if you're white, then the plantation owners might employ you as part of their labor force. If you were a man of color, you might be employed by a lesser recognized labor firm, law firm. But if you're a woman, or if you're a woman of color especially, there were no occupations available. You had to really scratch and fight. So she just hung out a shingle, had a more informal practice. Her first client gave her a fish in exchange for payment. So it gives you a sense of the barter system that's there and that type of work that she's able to create. But as she's doing that, her husband is pictured here as well. She and her husband are sharing childcare, and they're just appalled by the options that are available. They recalled sending Wendy to a church-based childcare and coming back with these very rigid stereotypes of what men can do, what boys can do versus what girls can do. So this is something that she really fought for because she herself experienced these dilemmas. And I really love the statement she provides about what is so important, what is the impact of having federal legislation. It's about resources, first of all, so that childcare centers, communities can develop solutions that would work for them. But it's also a statement about principle, that this is something that the federal government cares about, that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, that something can be done to improve the lives of women and the families who are experiencing these dilemmas. I'm getting a little bit late, is that right, Meredith? Okay, I won't read all this, but I just want to point out that there are tensions between the radical approaches and the liberal approaches. And here, I won't read all of this, but this is an interesting interview that was done by then a radical community activist, and now actually Jean Kwong has been an elected official. But she's pointing out how the people who are seeking revolution are trying to find alternatives to the existing political structure. And Patsy Mink responding and saying, yeah, but what is the alternative? And can't we make change within the political structure? So I'm not gonna go too much further. I encourage you to look at the work of Hunani K. Trask, who is a Native Hawaiian feminist sovereignty activist, and the ways in which she critiques Asian Americans as promoting settler colonialism in Hawaii. And I'm happy to share this PowerPoint in case you want to look at it a little bit further. So these are kind of the main points I wanted to emphasize for my talk, right? Trying to make visible Asian American feminism, and through that, really think about the ways in which Asian American women have challenged the existing power structure, the ways in which they're speaking back to power, that there's multiple ways in which they have done so, trying to more transformatively rethink what currently exists, but also trying to work within the system to push the system further. Okay, I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. That was amazing. I have definitely learned a lot, and I think my students did too. So I just want to encourage everyone to ask questions in the Q&A while Lauren McKee gives her response. So I'll turn it over to Dr. McKee now.
Thanks, Meredith. Thank you so much, Judy, for this incredibly important unpacking of the historical and theoretical dimensions of Asian American feminism, about the intersectionality of feminism and how feminist ideas and practices are inherently linked to all these other conversations about class and capitalism, militarism, the gendered dimensions of war and imperialism, and especially about Asian American women as political actors working for change at grassroots levels, but also within the system. And you've told us about Patsy Mink and bridge feminism and Capitol Hill feminism and about democratic governance. And this is all just incredibly important. I'm going to keep my remarks here brief because I do want to allow time for questions from our audience. But I do want to take what you've taught us here today and think about it a little bit in the context of the current political climate in the United States. And so much of what you've talked about here is so timely, and we have seen so vividly in the past months with the COVID-19 epidemic, especially these ideas about imperialism and citizenships and racism against Asian Americans. And so in some of the reading that I was doing to prepare for this, I was looking at a Pew report from July of this year that has some pretty startling figures that says 40% of people of Asian descent polled reported that they felt like they were more likely to experience racial slurs since the outbreak of the virus, which of course is no surprise considering the current president calls it the Chinese virus. I was also reading a New York Times article from April of this year written by Cathy Park Hong, whose work Minor Feelings you mentioned at the early on in your remarks. And in this article, she talks about one particular slur that I won't voice, but she said she never thought she would hear that in 2020. And in reflecting on how surprised she was at the hatred behind the use of this word, she also says that she had been conditioned to not see racist comments towards Asians as racist. And that when someone did point out a comment that was clearly racist against Asians, they were told, often by a white person, that the comments were not racial and that they were distracting from some bigger issue. And she said there's always some bigger issue. She says, and I'm quoting here, "I've been conditioned to think my second-class citizenry was low on the scale of oppression and therefore not worth bringing up, even though every single Asian American I know has stories of being emasculated, fetishized, humiliated, underpaid, fired, or demoted because of our identities." So anti-Asian racism is not new, of course, as you've told us, but it seems like since the outbreak of the virus this year, the most recent mutation of this racism seems really similar to the yellow peril fears in the US in the 19th century, when federal laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act barred Chinese immigrants from entering the US for fear they would degrade American society. And those who remained in American cities were segregated and forced to live in really terrible conditions. There's a lot of documentation of increasing hate crimes against Asian Americans this year. So the racial dimension is pretty clear. You talk a little bit about disappearing. And it seems to me the challenge this year or here is not that Asian Americans are disappearing, but that in fact they're more visible than before COVID, and that makes them even more of a target. So I was hoping that maybe you could talk about that a little more, but also about the gender dimensions of this as well. So how might the dimensions of this be different for Asian American women? And you mentioned this a little bit when you talk rightly about how the lockdown has really highlighted the differences in paid and unpaid work, and of course how women disproportionately engage in unpaid and undervalued child and elder care. And I was hoping that you could elaborate and expand on that a little bit for us now.
Thank you so much for your comments and questions. Those are excellent. I think when I wrote about women during the 60s and 70s, I talked about hypervisibility and visibility. So I think that's the case now too, right? There's ways in which Asianness is invoked constantly. So the trade war with China, the nuclear war with North Korea, the naming of the virus as the insistence on naming the virus by the president and his associates as China virus, Wuhan virus, Kung flu, right? There's a conscious targeting of Asia as the enemy and Asian Americans as the enemy. And it's interesting, I think I've seen some statistics that actually Asian American women tend to be targeted more for some of these confrontations, and they range from physical attacks to spitting, which I think is a really interesting act of aggression given the ways in which COVID-19 is spread, to just name calling. And so I think there's always that balance between hypervisibility and invisibility. And I think what's interesting about the invisibility is that even when you are hypervisible, you can't talk about that experience. So Cathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings, is this description of how she's had these cumulative experiences. And it's not just her personal, but it's historic, it's family. And she's had these cumulative experiences of being humiliated and being oppressed, but they're always dismissed as being somehow less relevant. Right? So that's a really wonderful point. I think now there's so many issues that Mink was involved in that are so relevant now. She was a big advocate for welfare reform, not to get people off welfare, to actually address poverty, right? So not to just like decrease the number of women who are enrolled, but to think about what are the necessary resources and support that a government needs to provide in order to alleviate the experiences of being poor. I've been writing about the 1990s when there were these debates about how to reform welfare. And at the time, if I'm remembering this correctly, I think 1 in 5 children were poor in the country, and 1 in 7 were on welfare. I mean, that is incredible, right? To think about a country that's relatively privileged, certainly not across the board, but that 1 in 5 children were considered poor. And now, given economic conditions, right, the number of people who are out of work, the people who are struggling to make payments, other countries have chosen different paths, just like other countries have taken a different path in terms of how to treat a pandemic. But other countries have taken another economic path as well. And so I think there's something very interesting and problematic about the ways in which this country thinks about the sharing of resources and the role of the federal government and of the state more generally in trying to sustain the people who live here.
Are you good, Dr. McKee?
Yeah, thank you, Judy.
We have a few questions. I'm going to just kind of work backwards. Dr. Jeff Ritchie asks, I'm curious to hear both Dr. Wu and Dr. McKee's comments on the relative invisibility of Senator and Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris's Asianness in contemporary public discourse.
Yeah, I've been seeing more and more coverage. And I think partly it's the ways in which we tend to think about race in the United States, right? The one drop rule. And that is very much connected to the political economy and the racial sexual system of slavery, right? That it's interesting in Western society, right? Heritage, patronage, lineage almost always flow through men. But in terms of enslaved women, it comes through, like that status gets inherited through motherhood. So I think there's a way in which we tend to think about Blackness as the primary identity for people who are multiracial. But I think it also speaks to the ways in which racialization functions differently for different groups. There are multiple challenges that the Asian American Pacific Islander community are facing right now. Pacific Islanders have one of the highest COVID infection rates and death rates, but it's not discussed. But at the same time, the ways in which African Americans or people who are deemed Black are racialized in this country is at another level, right? So if you think about the killings, the murders, the police violence, they're not absent from AAPI communities. There are similar experiences, but the level of racialization and oppression is on a different scale. So I think it's interesting to think about how someone who is multiracial identifies herself, right, in relation to both her parents, but also her lived experience. But it's also interesting to think about how people perceive those who are multiracial. But I am seeing some news coverage about Kamala Harris in terms of, both sides of her family. And I think she's also talking about various aspects of her family and her identity as well.
Great, thank you. Dr. McKee, did you want to add anything to that?
I have some thoughts about this, but I know Jeff and I can talk to him directly. I'm instead going to defer and let the conversation center instead on Judy.
Great, thank you, Dr. McKee. So I have another question by Wes Hansen, who's asking, in what way do you recommend that I, as a white man in the US, advocate for and uplift the voices of Asian women, both domestically and internationally?
This is a kind of an interesting question that I think Black Lives Matter has been talking to different groups about, right? And I think one of the things they've talked about is centering Black voices, right? So if you're not of that community, listening and hearing from people who are in that community about what their needs and their demands and the ways in which you might support them. I think something else they talk about is stay in your lane, right? So like figuring out ways that you can support, but not necessarily take over and not take the direction. So I think these are more kind of general ways of thinking about it. But I think being aware is, I think, one of the first steps, and then being in conversation and finding a way to support in a way that's productive.
Great, thank you. Dr. Jasmine Jones wrote, this was a great historical overview. Do you have any periodical resources like podcasts, magazines, blogs that you would like where Asian American women talk about current events or issues?
That's a great question. I don't blog and I don't do podcasts, although I'm very interested in exploring both. I'm learning how to use Photo Voice right now for a student community project. And it's a methodology that's trying to empower people to use visuals to tell stories and to challenge existing social hierarchies. And it's very much, it's described as a participatory action research methodology, which I love. Right? It's about empowering people you're working with so that they can tell their story, represent their understanding of the world. And it's a more democratic form of research, but it's also a more democratic form of dissemination, because photos can travel in ways in which academic discourse may not be able to. But I just want to refer you to at least one resource or two resources. One is that there's a great series of documentaries, animation documentaries called Unladylike 2020. These are maybe about 10-minute videos, and they feature both someone from the past, from the late 19th, early 20th century. It's to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and someone from the present. So the first video I saw was about the first African-American pilot, and then now someone who's flying jets. But it was just like this beautiful pairing and thinking about ways in which you might draw historical connections. The one that I worked on was from my first book, Margaret Jessie Chung. So she was the first woman of color. She partially cross-dressed. She had erotic romantic relationships with other women. And then they paired her with someone who is an Asian American female physician right now. So I recommend that resource in case you're looking for something that might be teachable. So it's called Unladylike 2020. And another resource that I'm working on right now is that we really want to recenter the discussion about suffrage by foregrounding empire. So the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century was also a time of continental expansion. And it's also a time of overseas expansion. And it was very much part of the suffrage discourse at that time. So Susan B. Anthony would say, well, why shouldn't white middle-class women get the vote if we're going to give the vote to Puerto Ricans, Hawaiians, Filipinos, right? These men are illiterate, they're colonized subjects. So the ways in which racial and imperial arguments were used as part of the effort to gain votes for certain portions of American women. So we're trying to develop a syllabus project and thinking, what if we did center empire? What if we centered Puerto Rico? What if we centered Guam? How would the story of suffrage be different? So we're in the process of doing that work. And along with recommended readings, we're trying to create some digital humanities projects, so alternative maps, visual timelines. And this is just kind of a first attempt. So we're hoping that whatever we create and we're able to help promote, that others people will take inspiration from it and continue to add to it and be inspired to do other types of projects like that.
Great, that sounds awesome. Thank you. So an anonymous person asked, or said, great presentation. What can Asian Americans do to be allies to the Black community today?
Yeah, again, there's multiple things. I was really impressed by the BLM reaching out to AAPI community members. They did a series of conversations, I think, with different communities, explaining who they are, what their goals are, and identifying ways in which we might align support. I myself this summer have been producing a series on anti-Blackness in the AAPI communities. So the demographics of California are very different compared to Kentucky. At UCI, the student body is maybe over a third Asian American, and there's also a significant international student population, predominantly from China, almost overwhelmingly from China. It's going to shift given what's been happening politically and in terms of the pandemic. And so we're trying to really put out or create opportunities for students of Asian American Pacific Islander backgrounds and community members of Asian American Pacific Islander backgrounds to address anti-Blackness within our own community. There was a series of really beautiful, we did a series of programs, but the first one was sort of modeled on the Dear Community letter that circulated in the aftermath of Ferguson. And I thought the letters were just so beautiful. These are online on Facebook, and I'm happy to share the resources with folks, but I'm hoping we might also publish the letters and trying to think about where do people come from, right? What experiences have they had in their past that shape the ways in which they think about race, the way they think about what's happening right now, and to try to shift those perceptions and to really encourage people to think differently. We've also had a conversation with ethnic press and trying to think about, well, how do they cover events like riots, right? How do they understand what's happening, and how can they promote a more responsible and wider set of experiences within communities that might be monolingual and rely on, home language sources to understand what's happening in the United States. So I think there's lots of things that can be done. There's so much work to be done, and I think it's important to pick something that you think you can make an impact to ally with others. So I'm not doing this work by myself. I'm partnering with community organizations and trying to hear what they think is important. And I'm also trying to create space for people across the campus to do this. I don't think there's a shortage of ideas. There's a lot of things that we can do. But I think it's important to pick something and to find community in doing it.
Great. That sounds all really important. And we are out of time, but I do have one more question. I'm wondering if you're okay with answering one more. Ollie Smith asked, can you elaborate on the military sexual complex and the implications this has on Asian women?
Yeah, I encourage you to read Joanne Nagel's book. I think there's various ways in which the military and the sexual are intertwined. So just the example I gave you, how sexual culture becomes part of military culture, right? These informal jokes, these stories that are told, and then sort of a nod, wink, wink, like everybody understands. But that draws boundaries about who's inside, who's outside. The military historically has been very gender segregated. It's changing now. There are disturbing, right, incidents of sexual violence within the military, by the military. And oftentimes it's often considered just that's the culture, right? That's the military culture. We just sort of have to accept it. for the women and for the trans folks who are entering in the military, right? It's part of the, again, kind of that insider, right? That you go through this hazing, this incredibly violent hazing. There's also the use of sexual violence in terms of warfare, right? The incidences of rape that's consciously or informally, right? But in both cases, part of an array of weapons that the military might use in terms of warfare. These are just a few of the examples, but I think that idea of the military sexual complex is trying to point out this is not just sort of some bad apples. These are not just sort of exceptions, but that it's deeply embedded in terms of the way in which the military functions.
Definitely. It's about structure. So Lisa Day from Eastern Kentucky University asked a question, but then she said she thinks you answered it. So I just wanted to acknowledge that she asked a question about decolonizing our teaching. But otherwise, we're good, and this was an excellent talk. So I just want to say thank you for coming and giving us this talk and taking time out of your day.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I love the questions. I'm happy to connect with folks, so feel free to email me if you're interested. You can find me by just by a Google search. And thank you so much, Meredith and Shadi and Lauren, for all the work that you've done.
Thank you.